and welcome to the IRDL Scholar Speaker Series. The series is coordinated by a working group of librarian researchers who participated in a professional continuing education program called the Institute for Research Design in Librarianship. We welcome you today from the William H. Hannon Library at Loyola Marymount University, which is the home of IRDL. My name is Marie Kennedy. I'm the Serials and Electronic Resources Librarian and the co-director of IRDL. And welcoming you also is Christine Brancalini, co-director of IRDL and dean of the library. As librarians, educators, and researchers, we welcome this opportunity to reflect and incorporate what we learn from these speakers into our own research efforts so that our methodologies integrate anti-racist and anti-colonial practices. We look forward to thinking critically about research and power with you at today's session with Dr. Anna Ndumu. So we'd like to tell you how today is going to run. We're recording this session and it will be made publicly available on the LMU Library's YouTube channel soon. We're going to be using the live transcription by Zoom. The Q&A as well as the chat have been enabled. Please use the Q&A function to direct questions to the speaker. And let's use the chat for commenting and sharing your thoughts with the group. We want this to be an uplifting and positive discussion. It's a professional event, and we will not tolerate any disrespectful comments in this session. We reserve the right to remove anyone from today's session if we observe anything that does not honor our speaker or fellow attendees. So our plan for this event is to invite Dr. Ndumu to speak, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions, and then we'll take a little break. After the break, we'll continue questions and answers and discuss how the scholarship presented today can be applied to library and information science. So we'll finish today at 1:30 Pacific time. If you're on Twitter, please use the hashtag IRDL speakers as you tweet about the session. An IRDL scholar will be your moderator for today. From cohort 1 in 2014, we welcome Tatiana Bryant. Tatiana, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tatiana Bryant, and I'm the librarian for Digital Humanities, History, and African American Studies at UC Irvine. This event has been organized in part through Loyola Marymount University and the William H. Hannon Library, and so we use this location to base our land acknowledgement. The land that the William H. Hannon Library sits on is seized territory of the Tongva peoples, the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, which is now known as the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. We want to start by recognizing their history and calling attention to their presence. We encourage you to learn more about the history of the land where you sit by going to native-land.ca. And if you are on Tovangar in particular, we are pasting 2 additional URLs in the chat box for you to explore as you wish. So today we welcome Dr. Anna Ndumu, who is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland College Park's College of Information Studies. She primarily researches and teaches on library services to immigrants, particularly Black diasporic immigrants, along with methods for promoting racial representation and inclusion in LIS. A former HBCU librarian, she is interested in the cross between Black identity, library and information services, and social inclusion. And Ndumu serves on the executive boards of numerous LIS organizations and directs several grant-funded library initiatives. You can connect with her at annandumu.com or via email if you so choose. Thank you, Anna. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tatiana and Marie and entire IRDL family for inviting me here today. I am incredibly honored. When I saw the lineup of speakers, I wondered why I was invited, honestly. And I also want to thank everyone who's in attendance today, because I know you have a lot of options. There's a lot of great programming, especially today, like 3 or 4 great sessions on similar topics. And also we're in a pandemic, and I know that many of us are in a Zoom coma. So I am really touched, and it's very special that you're here to hear me today. I also want to give credit and honor to the Piscataway Indian or Native American tribe, rather here in Maryland, where the University of Maryland sits. And again, I'm very happy to be with you today. Today, I'll be talking about erasure and essentialism, situating Black immigrants in LIS research. And again, I am Anna Ndumu, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. So the way today's dialogue is going to go is first I'll discuss some racist and ethnocentric underpinnings within LIS practice, and then I will discuss population and policy changes and how they kind of intersect with LIS. Next, I'll talk about new directions and new opportunities for research and some of the projects that I'm working on currently. And lastly, I'll ask a few questions to get us thinking about how to engage in anti-hegemonic research. So by way of a researcher positionality, this is me in a long time ago, basically, my formative years, and I migrated with my family from Central America, Nicaragua, to Miami. So I identify as an Afro-Latina. My mother and father raised us on the Pacific coast of Nicaragua. So we only spoke Spanish when we migrated, although my parents spoke English patois, because our community in Bluefields is a very rich multicultural community. When I migrated to Miami, so in that picture on the left, actually, I did not speak English. And so when I migrated to Miami, I really got to know a lot of different, oh, I apologize. I guess I'm not sharing my screen.
We loved hearing your story, though. This was great. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Now you get to see my pictures. Let's see if I can get my Zoom. Let's see. Just one moment. I think I might have to leave the session and come back. I apologize.
No worries, we'll be here.
Okay. There's always a hiccup, right?
Yes, yes.
It wouldn't be Zoom.
And I do not even see the box to leave, which is frustrating. Hang on just one moment.
You got it.
Probably bottom corner.
Oh, here it is. Okay.
While we have a minute, I was just going through the chat to see where everyone was joining us from. We have somebody from Sweden joining us today. Thank you for your commitment to being online with us. This is great. From all over the US, this is great. And I see someone joining from Ontario as well.
Okay, wonderful. So my screen should be sharing now. Am I right?
It looks perfect. Thank you.
All for your patience. And also your dedication. You were listening to only audio. That's exciting. All right, so this was the outline of my talk today. So again, I'll be going over racist and ethnocentric foundations, followed by population and policy changes, new directions, and anti-hegemonic research. All right, so these are the pictures I was talking about, right? So on the left is me at my elementary school graduation. And then by 5th grade, I was really immersed in reading and writing, and I loved poetry. This is me at a poetry contest with my mom. My mom is in both pictures. So libraries have always been a part of my life. And then on the right, that's me at my first job, an HBCU campus in Miami, historically Black college and university. I won't age myself. This is 20 years ago. And so again, I'm very excited about library and information science research, but I am also passionate when it comes to immigration, and I intersect with many different kinds of Black diasporic immigrants. My husband is an immigrant himself. He migrated from Uganda to London and then finally here to the US. So I kind of meander between different groups, among different people groups, Afro-Latinx, Afro-Caribbean, and African. So that's just a researcher positionality to give you context on why I do this work. And then as far as operational definitions, when I mention information, I'm defining information using Marcia Bates' definition. She wrote a typology, or she published a typology in 2006 that says information is embodied through us as information professionals, or it can be embedded in our spaces. It can be expressed and recorded, of course, through the materials that we organize, and it can even be experienced through our programming. And I am drawn to demographic techniques. So I tend to look at population changes. I love working with large data sets. And so I use the census. You'll hear me speak about the census quite a bit. And when I refer to an immigrant, I am talking about anyone who is born outside of the US and its territories, whether they are asylees, refugees, but I do not focus on international students because research has substantiated that their information worlds are vastly different. They leave and enter different information worlds when compared to other kinds of immigrants, and they are not classified as immigrants according to the USCIS. They are visitors. So that is how I operationalize an immigrant. And when it comes to Black, we know that Black is a social construct. It's a very imperfect variable to look at, but for the purpose of definition, I use the US Census Bureau definition of any person having origins in any of the Black racial groups in Africa. So in the US, what that means is an Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latinx person, an African, or an African-American. And of course, on the 2020 census, we could this time distinguish what kind of Black person one is. So let's talk a little bit about foundations. The area of library service to immigrants is one that has been a quintessential part of our profession for hundreds of years. And this is because at the same time that library practice was developing and really gaining some shape and some structure, immigrants were actually migrating to New York primarily. And there was a time where library practice was really concentrated around New York City. And so between 1880 and 1925, you see 11 million immigrants migrating to New York through Ellis Island. At the same time, you have many of the library thought leaders living in and around New York City, including Melville Dewey, who founded the American Library Association and the Columbia University Library School. And even though ALA was headquartered in Boston and eventually moved to Chicago, Melville Dewey felt like the ALA had grown too big and it was too large. And so they wanted an elite institution. So what no one ever really talks about is the American Library Institute, which was a good old boys club really of former ALA presidents. It was always chartered to be less than 100 members. And these thought leaders were right in New York City. And so they shaped a lot of library practice, especially when it came to practice concerning immigrants. And so then you had the Columbia University School of Library Economy. The first library school was founded in 1887. And so you have a lot of bossy men, and you also have a lot of eager new librarians, mainly women, who are very conscientious and in some ways overzealous. And you have this perfect recipe of opportunity to do progressive work. And I put quotes around progressive. So what crystallized is a very energetic and by the standard of the day, radical library practice to immigrants. And this work mainly involved white or white passing immigrants, and many of them were from Southern and Eastern European countries, which meant that they were non-English speakers for the first time, as opposed to Irish and English migrants who had come earlier. Now they were mainly Polish, Italian, German. So a lot of the services that we know and associate today with libraries were a part of this early history. Before that, libraries were very stoic. So if you can kind of picture language services, civics education, children's story time, becoming part and parcel of very academic spaces, very quiet elitist spaces, it was, again, progressive by the standard of the day. And now these services are capstone within library practice. But for all of their progression and for all of their sort of forward-thinking practice, it was also very problematic and prejudiced. There were some very unfortunate sentiment toward immigrants. And one of the main actors was John Foster Carr, who I write about in a forthcoming book on borders and belonging. And John Foster Carr was actually, ironically, an outsider to libraries, and he felt like he knew European immigrants better than anyone else. And so he was a very colorful figure and declared that he was a librarian and kind of rose through the ranks of ALA. And before you know it, he had a lot of position and power and influence. And so he writes here, he was a prolific writer. Alien storming all of our libraries, Books for Everyone movement aims to supply enormous demand and aid in Americanization work. So you can hear this sort of ethos of Americanization. And so John Foster Carr and the ALA published these guides, these guidas to help immigrants assimilate to US society. And sometimes they suggested things like grooming, brushing your teeth, not sitting or spitting in public inappropriately. So you see some essentialist views toward immigrants. And here's a quote from Carr: "As I talk to these good librarian folk, I find myself always in an atmosphere of enthusiasm when we speak of our immigrants, with our immigrants. They tell me, and I have collected hundreds of astounding instances of miracles wrought, of affecting gratitude, of beautiful friendships formed. Librarians have level judgments, undeceived of the failings of alien newcomers, but they also understand their possibilities." So you see this remedial yet very hopeful narrative. So library service to immigrants was very biased from the outset. You perceive this fatalist view of immigrants that underestimates immigrants' capacities. And at the same time, it excluded people who had had longer history in the US, especially when it came to indigenous communities that had been here for thousands of years, and descendants of slaves, and Hispanic and Asian immigrants that had already been here. So whiteness was the salient point, and white immigrants really were the focus of early immigrant outreach. And what is missing from this romanticized, historicized kind of quintessential immigrant purity story is that there were people of color who also matriculated or journeyed through Ellis Island. As you see here, you have women from Guadeloupe and other West Indian countries who came through Ellis Island, and their story is not a part of this, again, this romanticized American narrative and this picture of American exceptionalism. So there has always been bias toward immigrants of color. So now I'm going to talk about some population and policy changes and kind of overlap and map how library outreach relates to policy and population changes. So here's a timeline showing a history of key US policy on race, immigration, and citizenship, as well as key points in ALA history. It sort of shows the complex relationship between libraries, immigration, and race. The pin colors represent different things. Green is for immigration and citizenship. Red is for policy pertaining to Blacks or African Americans, and yellow is for ALA highlights, okay? So we know that the story of the US started way before white colonists came here, but for the purpose of this talk, let's begin with the 1500s when white settler colonists stole indigenous land. And then in 1619, we begin to see the forced migration of enslaved Africans to the Americas. And then in 1887, Blacks are considered 3/5 human according to the 3/5 Compromise for a future census. And 3 years later, that census took place. And we also had the Naturalization Act, which granted automatic citizenship to white male landowners. And again, that census finally came to pass, and the Congress and the US Constitution then dictated that every single person, citizen or not, must be counted every 10 years on April 1st. And in 1849, the very first anti-immigration party forms, and it's quizzically called the Know Nothing Party. In 1857, the Dred Scott Supreme Court ruling established that citizenship was not intended for Blacks. 6 years later, in 1876, the American Library Association is formed or founded. And right around 1880, we start to see a post-civil war industrial boom that attracted millions of immigrants from the Northeast, mainly to New York, as I mentioned. 2 years later, there's a Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigrants mainly on the Pacific coast. 5 years later, in 1882, the Columbia University Library School opens. And in 1892, Ellis Island opens to receive the sharp increase in mainly European immigrants. Okay. And then in 1896, we see Plessy versus Ferguson. And in this Supreme Court ruling, we have mandated racially segregated lifestyles, or I should say, racial segregation was mandated. There you go. And in 1897, the Rodriguez ruling permitted Mexicans to be considered white for citizenship purposes. In 1898, the Wong Kim Ark Supreme Court ruling prohibited children of Chinese immigrants from receiving birthright citizenship. 3 years later, citizenship is granted to Native Americans for the first time, but only those who were considered civilized, and that was 5 tribes. By 1910, an estimated 3/4 of New York City is comprised of immigrants. And that same year, Angel Island opens, but on the Pacific coast, and it's intended to be another Ellis Island, but instead it becomes the first immigration detention center. In 1917, ALA establishes the Committee for Work with the Foreign Born to assist European immigrants. And in 1923, the Ozawa Supreme Court ruling prohibited a Japanese man from being considered white for citizenship. But that same year, the Supreme Court contradicted itself in the Thin ruling, where they decided that an Indian can be considered white for citizenship. 1 year later, the Immigration Act of 1924 pretty much shut down immigration by establishing a quota system, and only a small percentage of people from select countries can migrate to the US. And this meant that a few years later, in 1927, the ALA Committee for Work with the Foreign Born is dissolved. So there's not a lot of advocacy after this point within ALA for immigrants or on their behalf. And so immigration slowed to a trickle for the next few decades, and Ellis Island is closed in 1954. That same year, the Brown versus Board of Education ruling overturned racial segregation, which had been mandated earlier in Plessy versus Ferguson, as I mentioned. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act brought sweeping social changes. And the following year, we have a similar act, the Immigration and Nationality Act, which also brought sweeping changes to immigration and did away with the quota system. But it wasn't until 2017 that ALA established a committee to focus entirely on library service to immigrants. and to create initiatives that trickle down. So essentially, this is 90 years after the CWFB was founded, and I'm honored to currently chair the SRIDP, which is the Serving Refugees, Immigrants, and Displaced Persons Committee of ALA. Now, as far as Black diasporic immigrants and how they're situated within all of this, and we see the very interesting and very connected relationship between policy, library development, and how Blacks are treated in the US. But as you can see, between the 1960s and the late 1950s and the early 1980s, there is a growing wave of Black diasporic immigrants. And this is because 64 majority Black nations were born and liberated from colonial rule. Many of these new countries are liberated from British colonial rule. Many of them are in Africa, 54, and then another 10 are in the Caribbean. And so now you see a new, vibrant, and vast Black diaspora, and you start to see the loosening of travel restrictions among majority Black people groups. Plus, there's better social conditions in the US for them to migrate. So throughout history, there's pretty much a strong relationship, and in some ways, sometimes a reflection within library science. And when it comes to policy, you see this reflection in this messy relationship, and library service tends to kind of ebb and flow depending on the sentiment of the day. And what happened then is that there's been a continuation of essentialist and very problematic thinking, very narrow thinking and views of immigrants. So John Foster Carr again writes, American civilization has never suffered any change in any of its essentials from the swarming millions of newcomers. But on the contrary, the United States has shown a marvelous power to Americanize the desirable immigrant. We hear this Americanization ideal, a dominant standard, and this view of American immigrant purity. And then about 60 years later, Childers and Post wrote their seminal work on the information poor in America. And Childers and Post went on to influence a whole line of scholars, including Elfrida Chapman, who is famous for her information poverty theory. But he wrote that immigrants, and especially Mexican immigrants, he wrote in the book, they wrote, I should say, in the book, Childers and Post, are isolated from information that sustain the dominant society. A number of characteristics magnify their isolation. They are proud of their culture and especially tenacious in their language. They distrust or dislike Anglo institutions such as schools, medical clinics, public housing, and so forth. And even today, we still hear these problematic innuendos. And Shen, who reliably quoted Childers and Post, wrote about what Shen called urban marginalized immigrants, which they never operationalize what urban means, but the racial undertones are decipherable. These immigrants have low information processing skills, including low literacy or language ability, physical disability, or poor social communication skills. And this was within LIS scholarship. And so as a result of all of these kind of deficit models and very essentialist belief systems, we have what I call 3 paradoxes. Number 1, LIS research and service to immigrants discounts broader immigration history and population and migration scholarship. And this is very counterintuitive because we are knowledge workers and we have information at the ready. So what we have is a professional naivete and ignorance among us as knowledge workers. And then number 2, there's an incredible and ironic lack of diversity within LIS outreach to immigrants. And this area is often very celebrated within equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And yet, immigrants are seen as a monolith, and there's very little understanding of just how vast the immigrant population is. So there isn't a lot of diversity, I should say, when it comes to how we perceive immigrants. And finally, the paradox that really troubles me the most is that we promote Anglo-conformist ideals by perpetuating the very hegemony that prompts migration. And so we promote the same types of services and the same types of relationships with immigrant partners, such that they perpetuate classism or racism or social stratification. And these are the types of conditions really in the type of thinking that advances hegemony and prompts migration, especially forced migration. And so based on these three paradoxes, we see an immigrant template and a subsequent library prescription, such that there's a lack of understanding of the role of information in migration. The idea that immigrants are information bankrupt or information poor no longer really holds in this day and age. Immigrants are arriving so well informed, and they map out their journeys even before they even leave their countries of origin. Now more than ever, information is at the immigrants' disposal. We saw with Syrian refugees, with the Central American migrants, the smartphone is today the modern compass. And then our services promote an Americanization ethos. And so citizenship, language programming, and assimilationist kind of behaviors are really the focus of library work. And I've been asked before, what's wrong with promoting Americanization? The problem is that to some groups and to some people, and we saw the recent uprising at the US Capitol, to some people, immigrants will never be American enough. So what we should be promoting instead is social inclusion. And then LIS research overlooks some groups, and this is the case with Black diasporic immigrants. Again, there's a tremendous lack of diversity in how we perceive immigrants. And for this reason, when I started to do my dissertation research and look at the literature, there were only 4 articles out of thousands that exclusively focused on any kind of Black immigrant, whether it was African, Afro-Caribbean. And so there is such a focus on language skills, again, that immigrants who come from Anglophone backgrounds especially are often overlooked. And that's the case with Black diasporic immigrants, many of which speak English. In fact, 75% of the Black diasporic immigrant group in the US is of Anglophone background or an English speaker because of British colonization. And finally, there's a tremendous unawareness of the variance among immigrants. And, excuse me. And one of the questions I got recently was, well, Anna, why don't they just get citizenship or become a citizen? And there's a lack of understanding of just how fluid immigration is, and immigration changes and policy changes, and also there are backlogs. One example is the recent policy change that the 2020 census test is now optional, and immigrants, this was just 3 days ago, immigrants can now, or those who are seeking citizenship and naturalization can now take the 2008 test. And so immigration is incredibly messy, just like information. And so there's an unawareness of the experiences of immigrants and just how difficult the US immigration landscape is. Based on all of this, I started thinking about new directions and what are some new ways that I could approach immigration and what I call immigrant information justice. And by way of context, there are 244 million immigrants worldwide, and 44 million of those immigrants live here in the US. And of course, the US population is between 330 and 340 million. So we have a huge immigrant population. We have the world's largest and most stratified immigrant population, the most diverse and the most vibrant immigrant population. And we receive immigrants from every single country in the world. No other country can say that. About 3.9 to 5.2 million of these immigrants are Black diasporic immigrants, excuse me. I can tell you definitively that this 2010 count, as far as Black immigrants and even the entire immigrant segment of the population, was a gross undercount. And we will probably again see a gross undercount because of some of the machination and some of the policies that kind of disrupted the 2020 census. So I believe, and other demographers believe, that this count is actually threefold, and we probably have upwards of 15 million Black immigrants in the US. So as I mentioned, post-colonial Black migration has really boomed, especially in the 21st century. Since 2000, we have seen mainly sub-Saharan Africans moving to the US and Canada. So the global South really is moving more than ever before to the global North, and West Indian or Afro-Caribbean immigrants and even Central American Black immigrants are migrating to the US and Canada. So here is what I call a cheat sheet on Black immigrants, and I think Tatiana and Kai can actually share this resource. And it kind of just helps to understand the Black population in the US, which is more diverse than ever before. And so when we speak of Africans, we're speaking mainly of sub-Saharan Africans, and African Americans, as we know, are descendants of slaves, Africans in America versus Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latinx. But I want to point your attention to the right. Usually this is where there's some confusion. And so, as I mentioned before, Black immigrants are more likely to speak English than any other kind of immigrant in the US, but they can also be of Francophone background, French speaking, or Lusophone background, Portuguese speaking, as in Brazil. Now, when we say a person is Spanish versus Hispanic versus Latinx, there's usually some conflation there. If a person is Latinx, they're from any part of Latin America, although those who are Anglophone are usually identified as West Indian or from the Caribbean. But then when it comes to Lusophone, they are included within that Latinx category. Hispanic is those who are Spanish speaking. So when we say someone is from a Latinx background, they can be Portuguese or Spanish speaking. But more than that, it's important to think about how age factors into immigration. And in my research, I've found that there are some key differences between how generation 1.75, those who have arrived in the US closer to birth, and generation 1.25, those who have arrived closer to adulthood, how they engage with information is very fascinating. I may touch a little bit on that a little later. There's one study that I'm going to focus on later on in this talk. So the guiding question for me in my research agenda is, how can we address immigrant well-being from an information standpoint? And number one, my hope is that we can address inequities. As I mentioned, the 2020 census was incredibly weaponized. There were a lot of mixed messages, an attempt to include the citizenship question, attempts to change the census deadline, and ultimately the Supreme Court struck this down 3 times. But there was a chilling effect, and so we anticipate that there will be a gross undercount of immigrants once again, and this affects our representation, our funding. So this is a social inclusion matter. And then we need to understand other facets of information and how they intersect with immigration. For example, automated deportation. The Obama administration in 2008 instituted AI-based deportation decisions in an effort to make it more objective and fair. We've learned a lot about AI bias since then. And so as a result, the main software, Palantir, is now known to be incredibly biased, and we've seen very disproportionate deportation. For example, when it comes to Black immigrants, they comprise only 5% of those who are undocumented. However, they make up 20 to 25% of those who are deported. So there's some structural racism involved in automated deportation decisions. And we saw that the Obama administration became known for its spike in deportation. And then how is information used to other immigrants? And we're dealing with this in the Library of Congress subject heading debacle. And so we still have not dealt with the illegal alien category within our Library of Congress subject heading. It became very politicized. And there's a great film on that, which I may talk about later. And then how does anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-immigrant slurs, how do these phenomena impact policy? For example, the idea of an anchor baby. And so my colleagues and I launched a study, a sentiment and network analysis of birthright citizenship, kind of banter on Twitter. Every now and again, of course, Trump is no longer on Twitter, but when he was, he would periodically post things about doing away with the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees birthright citizenship. So the team and I looked at this phenomena and tried to understand this idea of anchor baby and ideas of what true American identity really is. And what we found is that within the network, those who were more inclined to support a birthright citizenship ban, they kind of skewed more conservative, they were more likely to tag and share and retweet one another's talking points versus those who skewed a little bit more liberal and their sentiment was opposing the birthright citizenship proposal. And this is all hypothetical. It never went anywhere, but it provoked, right? And so those who were against it, they were more likely to cite sources and to cite the Constitution. So understanding how information behavior kind of connects with rhetoric and how that connects with policy is all very important. And I believe that LIS can inject and they can inform us as LIS professionals. We can really add to what is known about how people dialogue and how speech acts become policy. And then I worked on the Counted in Census project, which is also funded by IMLS. This was greatly disrupted. This work started in 2017, and there was a lot of ideation, and we had design thinking workshops. It was all beautiful. Everything was going great until the pandemic hit. And so this project was intended for librarians to have ready to use, downloadable and easy to customize materials to promote the census among immigrant communities. 50 librarians came out. We had great sessions, great workshops, and then we had the material, and then no libraries were open. So we quickly had to adjust, the team and I, and what ended up happening is that we worked with so many immigrant groups across the country, the Abrenehun Ethiopian Support Association, El Poder de Ser Mujer, Centro de Apoyo Familiar, Haitian Bird Alliance. And I hadn't even realized it until a student assistant told me that we worked with so many Black diasporic groups. It was open to everyone. I worked with the Asian American Justice Center, the Anti-Muslim Immigration League, so many different kinds of immigrant groups. However, I saw a very strong concentration of Black immigrant groups, and that made me personally very happy. So we have yet to see what the census count and what the results were from the 2020 census, but I'm very curious to see what changes there have been and to handle that data and to do some modeling to see how immigrants have progressed from 2010 to now. And speaking of progressing, another hope through my research agenda is to promote wellness. So I looked at information overload as part of my dissertation work. And instead of, again, starting from the basis that immigrants have no information or are information bankrupt or are information poor, I thought a more realistic way to look at it, knowing what I know about immigration and knowing all of the people who are immigrants in my life, a more realistic problem is the abundance of information. And so afterwards, after all of the studies were done, I started to see some variables that look like acculturative stress. So where I am now is trying to really connect LIS and information overload to acculturative stress. And there's a lot known within population research about acculturative stress, not enough known within LIS. So I'm trying to draw that bridge. I ended up with a scale to measure information overload. And what I'm trying to do now is include indicators of acculturative stress. And acculturative stress used to be known as just culture shock, but now it's evolved and it includes a lot of psychological variables and medical variables. And it's important when we think about health outcomes among immigrants. For example, there's a healthy immigrant paradox, which states that immigrants are more likely to come here very healthy. And in fact, migration does favor those who are healthy, whether they can endure biometric tests or they can endure arduous trips. It does favor those who are healthy. However, within 5 years of residence in the US, immigrants' health outcomes are subpar. And so what happens is that there is something that happens, a toxicity, an acute stress that happens, and trying to see what the role of information is in that in order to promote wellness. And also, how can our communities become welcoming communities? And libraries can also inform that. And lastly, how can we better equip information professionals to know a little bit about all of this? So again, I needed to pivot the Counted In program. So what ended up happening is that we partnered, ALA partnered with the Welcoming America organization, which creates a set of standards for communities and cities. And cities can become certified welcoming spaces. And now what's neat is that libraries kind of help to design that standard, and they always ask for feedback, especially from the SRIDP committee of ALA. But now there's an adapted guide where libraries can celebrate Welcoming Week, and that's the big programming around Welcoming America. And so how can we forge connections with like-minded institutions and organizations in order to promote wellness and social inclusion? And I have to, again, big up IMLS for funding all of this. And here's the information acculturative stress scale, which I'm now working on. This is another 3-year project. And some of the dimensions of information overload, which now is becoming information acculturative stress, are behavioral dimensions, whether we need, seek, or whether we are trying to retrieve information. There's some qualitative dimensions, such as the currency of a resource or the urgency, or how we need to treat it. Is it something we need to submit? So when I tested this scale and this model across the country with many different kinds of immigrants, they kind of centering Black immigrants, however, they always said that the US information landscape is too circular. Information is ubiquitous. In their home countries, they would go to the capital city. They would go to Port-au-Prince or Kingston or Lagos in order to do something. Here, what we think is efficient, having information in multiple formats. You can treat it digitally or in print, or you can go to an information space, going back to Marcia Bates' embedded information. Immigrants sometimes found that so overwhelming and circular. And so again, how can we connect information overload and acculturative stress to better understand and have a more realistic picture of the immigrant experience in 2021? And lastly, how can we amplify positives? We need better understanding of pre-migration information behavior, together with a team of 2 other Black immigrant women researchers. We call ourselves 3 Queens. One is in Canada, one is in the UK. And we look at the relationship between the US, Canada, UK, and Black immigrant experiences And we have now taken secondary data. We have IFLA data that has library penetration, how many libraries are in the country. And then we have an index of outmigration, net outmigration. We're trying to kind of do some residual modeling on whether libraries are a push or a pull factor, meaning that what is the role of libraries in places where there are a lot of people leaving and there's a brain drain to the US or Canada or the UK? Do libraries help retain that talent, or do libraries help push people out by educating them? And so what is the role of libraries in that dynamic? We're also interested in information assets. What do immigrants, what do they use? How do they customize information? What kind of tools do they prefer? And finally, I hope that my work centers diasporic information environments, which Sirivansan and Payati call an understanding of how information is used in diaspora among people who are dispersed around the world and remain interconnected as they are transnational. So how can we understand all of these three constructs? And here's a paper that I think Tatiana and Kai might have shared on disrupting digital divide narratives. And my goal was to try to understand a problematic metaphor, the metaphor of the digital immigrant and the digital native. And it comes out of education. There's an idea that teachers who are not fluent in technology devices, they are like heavily accented, unintelligible foreigners, or not so smart, not so flexible immigrants who spend most of their time grousing about how good things were in the old country. So you can see how button pushing this might be. It's a very problematic metaphor, which a lot of people have decried. And so this idea of a digital immigrant is often conflated with actual immigrants. And therefore you have these assumptions that immigrants are laggards when it comes to technology. And of course, we should do away with the metaphor just because it is very problematic, but also because it is imposed upon immigrant groups. So I wanted to test this out, and I looked at the American Community Survey, which is a micro sample of the US population. It's sent out every year to 3.5 million households, and unlike the census, which is very minimal, the ACS is huge, and there are 248 variables, and you can see really rich things and do some great studies. So it demonstrated what we already know about Black immigrants. They usually live in family households. Most Black immigrants arrive later in life, and therefore they arrive degreed and are employed above the poverty level, and so on and so forth. So those were the descriptive statistics. And what people might expect is that there is a deep divide and that immigrants are lagging behind the overall population. But in actuality, what I found was that smartphone access was actually higher among Black immigrants when compared to the general population. And so was tablet access, which was higher, way higher, 60% compared to 45%. And so Black immigrants had greater propensity when compared to the general population. However, Black immigrant households, and so the ACS is collected on a household level, and the household is the unit of analysis. So based on the respondent, households lag behind when it does come to desktop technology. And I'll tell you why this is important in a little bit. When it comes to overall internet access, there was no statistical difference between Black immigrant households and the general population. It was 81 and 82%, I believe. And so again, there's no difference, although people assume that there is a difference and a digital divide among immigrant households. When it came to cell phone data plan, it was 70% versus 68%. The text is a little small. Again, no statistical difference. High-speed internet, no statistical difference. Where there was difference was dial-up. Some Black immigrant households do depend on dial-up a little bit more than the general population. So what this tells us is that it points to, again, population and migration studies. There is some reliance on slower internet access, but there's comparable internet access and ICT access. It was on par with the general population. And immigrants, in this case, Black immigrants, do rely on small handheld devices, which again is substantiated by population and migration research, which tells us that immigrants really need on-the-go portable information access, especially because they're transnational e-actors, as they're called. And there is lower levels of laptop and computer ownership. In general, Black immigrants have similar digital experiences, but the metaphor of the digital immigrant versus the digital native would lead you to think differently. So how do we think about research differently, and how do we promote anti-hegemonic research? And I don't pretend to have all of the answers, but I can just speak from my experience and how I try to approach research. I hope that there's some nuggets and takeaways for you all. First of all, we should research, which Linda Twahi Smith challenges us in decolonizing methodologies. So I tend to ask myself, how can I reframe LIS scholarship? How can I avoid empiricism and absolutism? I use data and secondary data analysis quite a bit, but I know that empirical research is very imperfect, and statistics is a very imperfect mechanism, and there are no absolutes. And again, I try to also avoid analyst constructed typologies. Even if I'm working with quantitative data, I tend to ask myself, how can I avoid methodological individualism? Research that centers me as the researcher, or scholarship that centers me as a researcher and never really amplifies the voices of the participants. And how can LIS move away from an over-reliance on survey and case studies? So I tried to kind of diversify what's out there. The 4 studies that I mentioned are on or about Black immigrants. They were all case studies or surveys. How can we sort of diversify that a bit and get their voices and perspectives? And lastly, we are a very race-centric society. And when handling race, and as Merton famously said, race is a masterclass in the US. We're very, very focused on race here. By contrast, some countries like France or Australia do not collect a race variable on their census. So we do center race here, but I need to be very specific on the aspect of race that I'm studying. Is it racial stratification? Is it structural racism in immigration? So being very clear about what it is that I'm studying is a goal of mine. And then how am I treating race when I'm analyzing statistics? And a lot of people make this mistake, avoiding making race simply a control variable, and heavens forbid, a causal variable. Race never causes anything, but racial stratification and racial bias does. So being very clear about what it is that I'm studying. And I'll leave you with this quote by Edwidge Danticat, who is a Haitian researcher. She was one of the first to call out biased immigration and immigration detention, especially toward the Haitian community in Miami in Brother, I'm Dying. But this is her work, Create Dangerously, the Immigrant Artist at Work. And I asked her a few questions. I said, you know, you talked a lot about writing, but as a scholar, we are writers too. What advice would you have? And she said, create your own style of scholarship. And she went on to say, write it all out first. First, write it to you, then make it objective, write raw and then prune, work with the documents. There's a journalistic element. Let your work bear witness. So thank you very much. And the list on the right is everyone that I have to thank, all of my research partners, all of my sister scholars, and all of my family. You're all wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. We're now going to move on to the Q&A and discussion part of this event after we reconvene for a brief comfort break of about 4 minutes. And when we reconvene, we'll start to discuss how the scholarship presented today applies to library and information science. It is all LIS, and we'll do a deep dive into that. But before we break, I really want to extend our thanks to Dr. Ndumu today. And she will again rejoin us following this brief break, and we'll move on to the Q&A and the discussion. Thank you.
We'll be back at 1:07 to begin our conversation. Stay with us. We'll be back at 1:07. We'll begin the session in 2 minutes. Please stay with us for the question and answer. We'll be back in just a minute. Enjoy your stretching break.
Welcome to the discussion portion of today's event. We will have until 1:30 Pacific to discuss these aspects as a group. I will be leading the discussion, and we have several questions for your consideration. You can enter your responses and thoughts in the chat box, and we will moderate based on that. Additionally, if you have any questions that you wish to ask the group, you can use the separate Q&A function. Depending on time and how things go, we may be able to get to those as well. I'll start things off with our first question. And again, you can engage in the discussion through the chat box. So Jennifer asked this question, and we'll start here. Anna, what are some recommendations you might have for shifting the focus from Americanization to social inclusion? Are there particular resources you can point us to, particularly to pass on to our library science students?
That's a great question. And I actually have a few slides. I packed a lot of stuff, so I didn't want to overpack, but I'll quickly share a framework that I created. So I'll just share my screen. So it is here, the HEART framework. So Jennifer, I would really recommend helping to shift the focus of our work from remediation to humanitarianism, and from prescription, library prescription, to understanding immigrant experience, from assimilation to acculturation, from idealism to realism, and from ethnocentrism to transnationalism, understanding that immigrants are global people, right? And that the American ideal may not be the immigrant's desire, so we shouldn't really be imposing on that. How can people retain their cultural identity while also adjusting and thriving in the US instead of what some consider assimilating up, right? Or even sometimes white passing. So the HEART framework is centered around humanitarianism. There's a scholar at the University of Washington iSchool who created this. I'll try to drop this in the chat box. It's called Mind of Five, and it's a game for librarians to play, a card game actually. And it's built on 5 ideas for respecting immigrants and migrants. I think there were a few of the creators in the session when I looked through the chat. And so, you know, if they wanted to pop in something about the game, that would be wonderful. And then there's a simulation game also where you can go through an online game and make decisions as if you were an immigrant and take on a role or an avatar. So you can use this with your students. And then there's an archive on the University of Minnesota's Special Collections site, which collected oral histories of immigrants and their journeys, so you can hear the immigrant experience and how they acculturated. Then someone mentioned Change the Subject, all about advocacy to change the illegal alien subject heading. That's another great video for LIS educators. And then transnationalism, and understanding how many apps and how many tools were created with the immigrant in mind. WhatsApp was created by an immigrant for immigrants, for example. And so really understanding how much information and how information empowered immigrants really are.
Thank you, Anna. Can you speak to the distinctions between forced migration and voluntary migration? What services would be needed for the forced migration groups? What services are more useful for the voluntary migration groups?
Great question. So forced migrants are usually those who are displaced through natural disaster, political unrest. They usually are asylees or refugees. And then voluntary migration is those who move for quote unquote opportunities. So these are job seekers, those who may migrate for education and then stay after. So we know that international students are not technically considered immigrants, but so there is the type of migration where one seeks to move, and then there's another type of migration where you didn't have an intention on moving, but you had to move. So for forced migrants, they're going to need a lot of social services. The library is going to need to connect with partners, with settlement agencies. And then for voluntary migrants, those are a different typology, which is they're going to need an array of services. But it's very difficult to say that one will need job placement and the other won't, because the experiences of immigrants, whether you are forced or voluntary, sometimes overlap. Some of the stressors are the same according to my data. So there are no hard and fast rules, and even the individual may vary. So you may have to think about it on a case-by-case basis, but usually those who were forcefully displaced need acute resources and a lot of different support. So that's important to consider.
Thank you. So do you see a connection between wellness and preserving the immigrant experience, or honoring one's own history?
Definitely. I think in connecting with immigrants, I'll share an example of this actually. When I was doing census outreach and I started to connect with the Ethiopian community, and if you know the Ethiopian community, they have their own language, their own written system, they have their own calendar. They're not even in 2021. So their New Year's is a source of tremendous cultural pride because they're not on the Caesarean calendar. So they're countercultural, if you will. So when they invited us to speak as part of their New Year's celebration, it's akin to Chinese New Year. And I was honored that they gave us that space. And what they wanted to know also is, how do they preserve that New Year's celebration? And I'm not an archivist, but I think there's something to be said about capturing immigrant experiences and stories and journeys, and also helping them to curate their own stories, going back to analyst constructed typologies and researcher-centered work, helping communities be a part of the research project and the information collection process is so powerful, and they become co-owners of a project, which is so important to ensure as a researcher.
So this is a comment as well as a question. We really appreciate all the historical work that you're doing here. It's essential for all of us to see how LIS practices are embedded in the past. This is amazing, necessary work. I was wondering about how Latinx communities, which of course are incredibly diverse, fit within your research, especially Afro-Latinx. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking in particular about the complicated relationship between those who identify as Latinx, whether they're white or indigenous or mestizo or any other kind of term, and Blackness, and how many Latinx people who identify as Latinx reproduce white supremacy in their everyday lives.
Yeah, this one hits home for me. Growing up in Miami, being bilingual, being a Black Latina. I remember once being in a store and my mom told me to get something and the cashier didn't know we spoke Spanish, and she said, "Ay, que jode," and which means, oh, she's such a pain in the butt. And my mom was angry, and I can just see the reaction. I think suffice it to say that it's a very complicated experience growing up a Black Latina in Miami, where there are a lot of traditional mainstream mestizo Latinx immigrants. And one of the things that I came across in my data collection is Black immigrants that I know, that I said, hey, I'm doing this study. It's relying on snowball sampling. So anybody you know, get them to do this study. And how many Black Latino immigrants did not identify as Black, just Hispanic. So sometimes there may be some erasure, or there may be Latin passing, which is another complicated construct. But more and more I'm finding Afro-Latinos who are very proud of their identity, their Black identity and their Latino identity. And especially here in the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia area, there are a lot of organizations that amplify the Latinx, the Afro-Latinx experience. So I think there's a lot more visibility now. I'm hoping that's the case, but when I was growing up in Miami, I can tell you there was not a lot of representation. Selena and Celia Cruz, which Selena, the reason why she resonated with me is because she crossed over, right? And as I said, my parents were bilingual, so I grew up in a bilingual, very Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Latinx household. So what I'll say about that is that there's still so much to be done about racism in the Hispanic community. I can share story after story after story, and there's a long, very deep and painful history. Colonial slavery, it's so embedded in such a part of Hispanic culture, Latinx culture. Is going to take decades and generations to undo that experience as well. But in my work, I did find that social identity and racial identity varies. There's some people who look like me and they do not think they're Black. And so people always have to self-identify, and however hard that is for me to hear, I have to respect that.
That's a very interesting point to make. And it's something to think about when we design library programs, maybe geared towards particular regions or particular nations, without understanding the complexity of race and ethnicity within those places. Can you talk a bit about the term non-resident alien and how you contextualize it within your work?
I don't use that term. I use permanent undocumented immigrant or permanent undocumented resident. I avoid alien because it others. I have moved away from using foreign born because it others. So my own growth has been a very special thing too, because I've learned a lot of things along the way from mentors. Clara Chu, I've learned a lot from Clara Chu, who's at the University of Illinois, and so many other people who have really challenged me. But as I began to read and engage with the literature, I really felt like terms like non-resident alien may be problematic. I think there's a question also about the J1 visa. So let me see if I can understand it. It's a term, let me take this check over. It's a term that evokes an otherness. Yeah, exactly what you said. It evokes otherness. So illegal alien, non-resident alien, any of those terms really pigeonhole people and never really see them as full new Americans, whether they have documentation or not. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Well, another, lots of things coming through here. So one person wants to know more about your research around the 1.25 generation and the 1.75 generation immigrants and their information spheres.
Yeah, so 1.75, which migrated closer to adulthood, they really reflect, when I looked at people who migrated in adults, and I compared them and I kind of modeled 1.75, those who migrated closer to adults or adulthood reflected the information practices that they had described from their countries of origin. Whereas those who migrated closer to birth, 1.25, they reflected a lot of different digital practices, especially, that are characteristic of the US. So it's very interesting because I also included third culture kids as part of that typology of Black immigrants. And so third culture kids are by and large those who have either been born here or brought here very, very young, and they're in this hybrid cultural environment. So their information behavior was really rich and interesting to to really study because it wasn't at all what I expected or predicted. I'd love to continue looking at that group, and especially in this area, this is a very young adult heavy area, or the population here is quite young in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And there are a lot of Black immigrant enclaves, the largest Ghanaian, the largest Ethiopian, the largest Nigerian, a substantial Dominican group, which I've really connected with and done some programming in Spanish with, and so many others. So I'd love to continue exploring that, especially in the area in which I'm at. Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about the census categorization of race and ethnicity? It's a complicated structure of color, culture, and language.
Yeah, a lot of people were excited that you could now distinguish your ancestry. For example, Middle Eastern North Africa for the first time was a category and people felt seen. So the feedback I was getting, and that was actually part of our talking points, we shared that you can say you're Ethiopian now, you can say you're Ghanaian now. So it actually helped with some buy-in because there's a lot of cultural pride as far as heritage. But then other people felt like we are stratifying too much and segmenting people too much, and it creates tribalism, especially among the Black population, where you have ethnic differences. I felt that it's time to better understand the different nationalities that we have in the US. And I think some really good policy is going to come out of it, some really great resources will come out of it. So I'm an optimist. I think it's a good thing. And it really helped. It certainly helped when it came to marketing.
So I want to pivot a little bit. Can you tell us how COVID has impacted your scholarly work?
Well, my brain is mush. I can't focus. That's the number one problem. It is, I think right now, everyone's experiencing Zoom fatigue, which makes me very appreciative of those who came today. So the prospect of asking people to participate in a virtual interview or a virtual focus group, it's very difficult to get buy-in right now. But I am luckier than most researchers because I do like secondary data. And in LIS, we have so much secondary data that hardly anyone explores. I always wonder why. Because we have IMLS, huge data sets, Pew data sets, ALA has data through the Office of Research and Statistics. And so we really need to use that a little better than we do. The Association for LIS Education compiles data every year also. So what I did was start to look at, as I mentioned with the Three Queens research team, looking at library penetration and net out migration, for example. And so I don't have to leave home to do that. So that's kind of a benefit for me in my work. But I really do try not to have like that methodological individualism where I only do one trick. So I do try to triangulate my research with some immigrant perspective and what they have to say. And it seems like for now, that'll have to wait for a little while. So I'm hoping that things get better very fast so that I can hear what the communities are thinking. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about the efforts you make to share your research with the communities that you work with?
Yeah, so that's actually something I'm trying to be better at because I speak, but I sometimes I'm very shy. I don't know how to explain this, but there's already a researcher disconnect. And for several groups, I had to gain trust before I could even engage. And so I'm trying to find a way to share. What I've come up with is a workbook, basically, a self-paced workbook. And with 2 other groups, I'm working on self-paced courses, one to recruit immigrants to the LIS field. I'm thinking self-paced lessons are where it's at and workbooks are where it's at. So I don't want to come off as a sage on a stage or the professor. My hope is to be relatable and down to earth. So I haven't quite mastered that yet, if I can be honest, but there are some groups that really listen, like Untitled Black. I work with them, they're so dope. And in other groups, I'm still trying to figure it out. I invite them to everything that we do, that's for sure. And then I send opportunities their way, but I'm trying not to be that researcher, you know, and be just Anna, call me first name. And so that's something I'm actually thinking through. And I really hope, because there's such an emphasis on face-to-face and synchronous rather than asynchronous relationships and being in the same space and sharing and breaking bread. So when the pandemic lets up, I'm hoping that I can really connect with immigrant groups and share more. I've been a little shy about that, if that makes sense.
Do you think that there should be more of an effort to translate LIS research?
Yes, definitely. I think LIS has so much that it can offer to other fields, especially demography and population studies. So many other fields have an opportunity to learn from us. So yes, absolutely.
That's a great point.
Sorry to bust
ahead,
in and end this. Yeah, we're just about out of time. And I wanted to be sure to give the attendees time to give thanks to our speaker and our moderator today. I mean, just wow, we're so lucky to be here today, y'all. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Tatiana, for being a great moderator.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
And since this is the final presentation in our inaugural series, we wanted to take just a moment to reflect on the 5 presentations. Over the course of the series, we've learned about feminist indigenous approaches to inquiry, with resources mentioned that point to projects and writings that support a critique of settler colonialism. We've learned about narrative inquiry as a way to honor the research subject by engaging them in the story the researcher's telling. We heard from 2 speakers about the act of research as a collaboration. The researcher and the participant partnered to tell a more full, more holistic story. We learned about the sassy slash. And today we learned about the racial bias that's built into the history of librarianship as it relates to immigrants. And I especially appreciate that Anna is prompting us to consider really strength-based orientations instead of a deficiency orientation when we approach researching these groups, so that we don't pigeonhole the group we're studying. So the speakers in this series are prompting us to consider what it would mean if we decenter ourselves as the primary researcher, to instead shine the light on the participants in our project, really as partners instead of data givers. We're eager to hear how you may incorporate what you've heard in this series into your own work. Please stay in touch as your own work evolves. Thank you for your attention to this series. We hope we've jostled your familiar research footing. I'd like to thank Loyola Marymount University for its support of the Institute for Research Design in Librarianship. Thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for your support of IRDL for 6 wonderful years. And thank you to the team of IRDL scholars who labored to put together this learning event. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you again, Dr. Ndumu, and thank you, Tatiana. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.